Welcome to Happy Times and Places, which is normally a Doctor Who episode commentary podcast. But today I, Toby Hadoke, have asked my guests to choose their 5 favourite things about an episode of something else. I will commentate along and choose my favourite things too. We're making a bit of an experiment, which by its very nature is a risk.
Hello Toby, I'm Andy Murray. I'm an author and journalist. I'm the writer of Into the Unknown, a biography of Nigel Kneale that was published by Head Press. And as we both know well, our first ever conversation at Excess Malarkey Comedy Club over 20 years ago was about Nigel Kneale and Quatermass. I told you I was writing my book, you told me that you wanted to write one, and now that has come to pass, and I'm very delighted that that's the case. And my book is looking forward to joining your book on the bookshelves. So, as requested, to mark the occasion, I have rewatched the first episode of the Quatermass Experiment, and I have chosen 5 things that I particularly like about it, which are to follow.
Yes, normal service has been interrupted to bring you not a commentary about Doctor Who. Happy Times and Places will get back to normal in a couple of weeks' time, but we find ourselves in the midst of a very exciting period of my life, so apologies. I'm craving your indulgence because I have literally this week, 2 days ago as we speak, held in my hands for the very first time my book, The Quatermass Experiment, which is about the making of the particular television programme that I will be commentating along for the next 2 episodes of Happy Times and Places. As you heard, that was the lovely Andy Murray. What a wonderful coincidence it was that during a comedy night many, many years ago, over 20, I made a reference to something old-fashioned. I can't remember what it was, and it got a big laugh. And I said, oh, well, I can go further back from that. And then I mentioned something else, and I mentioned Quatermass, and more for my own enjoyment than anything else. But it was basically to invoke something old and ancient that nestled alongside whatever it was that I'd mentioned, farthings or whatever. But as I say, largely for my own amusement, I really got to the end of the joke and just threw that in. And this chap came up to me and said about Quatermass, and how lovely. Now I have to say I got a bit of a pang of jealousy that he was writing a book about Nigel Kneale and was in contact with Nigel Kneale, because I'd harboured this desire to write a book about Quatermass and had amassed a load of material, but it hadn't really materialised, and I'd kind of dismissed any idea that it probably would. But I'm sure I said to him, yes, I'm writing a book about Quatermass, but I probably hadn't done any proper work on it for a while. And his book has come, and it's been reprinted, and it's brilliant, and he had great access to Nigel Kneale, and is a fantastic scholar on the subject of Nigel Kneale, and rather beautifully lives literally 5 minutes walk from my house. So if a bomb drops on Chorlton-cum-Hardy tomorrow, there's a lot of knowledge about one particular television writer that will be wiped out in one fell swoop. But isn't that extraordinary that the two of us live not far from each other? And actually, we've recently encountered Bronte Schultz, who's a fantastic academic who also knows her Nigel Kneale, and she doesn't live far away from us either. So there must be some sort of ley line here of Kneale flavour. That means so many people have gathered in one spot. Well, he was born, although he was a Manxman, he was born in Barrow-in-Furness in the north of England, not too far from where we are. So maybe it's something to do with that. Maybe he's echoed along geographical lines. But for those of you who usually listen to this for Doctor Who content, we are talking about the Quatermass Experiment, which was broadcast in 1953, but 6 weeks after the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in Westminster Abbey. Everest had just been conquered. The Comet Jet was taking people to the other side of the world. Rationing had kind of ebbed away, and normal life was returning after the terrible period of the 1940s where World War racked the world and terrible things happened. And we asked the best of our ordinary citizens, and where the world saw things it never imagined that it would, and technology had positive and apocalyptic consequences. So all of this is in the air, and Quatermass is so relevant to so much of Doctor Who as well. So I'm going to commentate along to episode 1 of the Quatermass Experiment. I will bear in mind that some of you have not seen it, so hopefully it will be designed that you don't have to be watching along, because you may not have the Quatermass collection on DVD. If you don't have the 2 episodes of the Quatermass Experiment, they are going to be extra features on the Hammer limited edition version of the film version of the Quatermass Experiment, which is coming out very shortly and is on sale now, as is my book, The Quatermass Experiment, The Making of TV's First Science Fiction Classic, which is available from 10 Acre Films and is released on May the 12th. I have a launch in Manchester on May the 11th and a launch at the BFI in London on May the 19th. So if you're listening to this when it goes out, there is Quatermass in the air. If you're listening to this sometime after, well, I'm sure there will still be paperback versions of the book available from 10 Acre Films. So go to their website and order your copy. It is not available in the place named after the rainforest, because frankly it seems mad to put this much effort into making something only to give the majority of the money to the people who send it out to you from a warehouse where people aren't paid very well. Anyway, let's not get into that. Let us get into the world of 1953, the birth of British television science fiction, and the genius of the writer Nigel Kneale, who was asked to fill what he called a mortal 6-week gap in the TV schedule. A lot of television at this time was filmed theatre or sort of children's series television, largely went out live. It's actually very difficult to judge the Quatermass Experiment against much which went out at this time, because it is the second oldest surviving drama recording. There's a play from the previous year, It's Midnight Dr. Schweitzer, starring Andre Morel, who later plays Quatermass in Quatermass and the Pit, and Reginald Tate, who plays Quatermass in the Quatermass Experiment. And it was produced by Rudolph Cartier, who is the man behind the production of the Quatermass Experiment. So a lot of the same personnel are there in that earlier tele-recording. And but it's quite a stagey piece with limited film sequences, but some interesting film sequences that are quite ambitious, very ambitious for the time. Quatermass Experiment went out live from Alexandra Palace, the rather pokey studios of Alexandra Palace, shot on Emitron cameras, which are very heavy, where you had to change the lens, sort of manually clunk it round. The viewfinder showed an upside-down image for the cameraman. It was really primitive stuff in hot studios, and I've been there on the hottest day of the year, and my goodness, yes. So let me transport you back in time to the 18th of July, 1953, and the birth of British television science fiction. I'm going to press play on episode 1 of the Quatermass Experiment in 3, 2, 1. So, and it starts with Mars from the Planet Suite. And one of the things discovered during my research was that which is why you should never trust the paperwork, is that the version that is on the Piers B paperwork for the Quatermass Experiment of Mars, that, if you believe the paperwork was being played, is not the right one, and also it's being played at the wrong speed. It's sped up. Now, whether this was deliberate or not, I don't know, but it's certainly not played at this speed in episode 2. We have some stock footage here. It's not actually the first footage of an orbit shot. It's actually the second, but I've painfully gone through all the stock footage, and there's various bits of stock footage in the Quatermass Experiment, and made sure I know what all of it is. There's one bit I haven't identified, but I can narrow it down. But yes, and this is narrated by John Glenn, who's not in this episode, but he joins the action next week as Dr. Gordon Briscoe. Again, the paperwork suggests that it's Stuart Mortimer, one of the crew, but it's not. It's John Glenn, and I found paperwork to back up what my ears were telling me. But again, it's just a sign that just because something is written down in the BBC Written Archive, it might not necessarily be true. And here we are in the British Experimental Rocket Group. And the first person we see is actually not Professor Quatermass. It's Isabel Dean as Judith Caroon. She was one of the best-known faces on television, and in fact in the 1950s was a very fondly held actress and in my mum's generation, everybody knew who Isabel Dean was, and she was one of the first people I wrote to for my book, and she wrote me a lovely letter back, and we actually kept in touch for many, many years, and she was so kind and encouraging. And the two actors that we see here there's four personnel of the British Experimental Rocket Group. We've got Professor Bernard Quatermass here, played by Reginald Tate. I love the fact he has a sort of scientist's white coat, but also has a cravat of the leading man. And he is assisted by John Patterson, played by excellent actor Hugh Kelly in his last television role. He'd previously been in a number of productions, including Arrow to the Heart, which was Nigel Kneale and producer Rudolph Cartier's first collaboration, and he played quite a vital part in that. And he is assisted by Peter Marsh, played by Murray Watson, in his first television. He doesn't do another television for 5 years. And when I spoke to Mr. Watson, who was so kind again, I had lovely letters from him, and in the end actually visited him, his home, and he lived around the corner from where Nigel Kneale lived with his wife, Judith Kerr, who wrote The Tiger Who Came to Tea and Mog the Forgetful Cat and all sorts of other children's classics. But when I visited Judith, Nigel Kneale had died, but I went into his office, and she had one of the key props from the Quatermass Experiment in a plastic bag in the corner. But yes, she let me into Nigel Kneale's office. And yes, but Murray Watson lived around the corner, and I visited him first. I visited him a few years before I visited Judith Kerr, and I dreamt of bumping into her on the way to his and availing myself of an opportunity to request an audience. But I got one, thanks to other things that occurred. Well, but I won't be shy about it. I did a radio adaptation of The Road by Nigel Kneale, and Judith Kerr came to the recording of that, and I was able to speak to her and establish a contact. Contact was established. This episode is called Contact Has Been Established with Judith Kerr, and she then let me go to her house, and I got a lengthy interview with her for the book, and she is quoted a lot, as is Nigel Kneale's brother Brian Kneale. So I got the inside story about Nigel Kneale leading up to writing the Quatermass Experiment. So the wheeze is that the ship is missing. Remember, this predates any space exploration, and of course it's the British Rocket Group that manages to get a ship into space. And in the time-honoured tradition, which has become familiar to anyone that's particularly watched Pertwee-era Doctor Who, there's an annoying man from the Ministry, in this case Blaker, played by the actor W. Thorpe Devereux. And I love the fact that we're at a time, even though it's only 10 years away from Doctor Who starting, there's a sort of generation of actors. There aren't many actors in Quatermass that cross over into Doctor Who, and it's almost like we're in a sort of slightly different generation, and where you have actors called things like W. Thorpe Devereux and Fletcher Lightfoot and all sorts of other names that actors sort of stopped having. But Balliol Holloway isn't in this, nor is Moultrie Kelsall, but they're the sort of there is an O'Donovan Shiel in Quatermass too. Actors' names that I rather like from times gone by. Poor old Isabel Dean has to do a lot of the camera being on her while she looks rather sad, because she is Judith Caroon, the wife of Victor Caroon, one of the 3 astronauts who've gone into space in this, the first manned space rocket. And there's a lot of drama in this episode while they're waiting for the rocket to come back. Now, I suspect if you were doing this today, you'd pretty much get rid of all of this, because we're kind of used to rocket flights now, and what the story of this really is what happens when the rocket returns. But remember, this is less than 10 years away from World War II, where lots of people waited with bated breath to hear of crews coming back from dangerous missions, and lots of wives like Judith were hoping, against all hope sometimes, that their loved ones would make it back. Judith, rather promisingly for something from so long ago, is a key member of the team, so she's not only waiting for her husband to come back, but she's one of the scientists who, if she gets her sums right, will facilitate his return, and if she gets her sums right, might be responsible for his death. So that's a lovely emotional pull for that character. And in the early planning for the serial, she was not his wife, and it was quite a late development for Kneale to give the female character a stronger in on the action. And she is called Judith because she is named after Judith Kerr, who is Nigel Kneale's girlfriend at the time. They married a year or so later. It's all right, I'm not letting myself go is a very 1950s line, isn't it? And there are a few bits like that you just have to look through the lens of what was normal at the time. Quatermass's Reginald Tate, he had been offered the part and accepted it, and then he disappears from the cast list shortly before filming begins. And I mean that by filming, because there is pre-filming done at the beginning of July. This is the 18th of July, this live broadcast. But and Kneale hasn't written all the scripts by this point, but he has plotted it out enough to know what the film sequences need to be. So he has the strange position, but look at this, that we've had then about 5 seconds of black to suggest the passing of time and just to reset the action to a bit later. That would not be, you would not do that now. There's a beautifully naturalistic performance here from Reginald Tate, I think. But yes, what was I saying? Yes, so the pre-filming. So Kneale has this strange thing where he's writing sequences for episodes 4, 5, and 6 before he's actually written the scripts for them, in order that those scenes are written ready for them to be pre-filmed. And there's some pre-filming at St James's Park on Duck Island, and some bombed out parts of London with the returned astronaut encountering a young boy who's playing space fiction. Kneale never forgets to allude to the fact that sci-fi is the stuff of kids' drama and schlocky films. He's aware of the feelings towards the genre by the viewing public, and possibly a little bit himself. Although I've never quite got to grips with that. He's always said he's not really that interested in science fiction, and yet he writes quite a lot of it. And yes, he does invest it with character and with the tools of horror as well. That's the genius of Nigel Kneale, is he tells his science fiction stories with the tools of horror pictures. And here he does the science bit. This is very much, and he referred to this later when he said, it seems a bit shocking today that you needed this scene, but he was aware of that. But it did need this scene for an audience that might not be as clued up with how things that we take for granted that we know about spaceflight. He has to have the stupid man from the Ministry turn up and have it explained by Quatermass. Now, it's useful scene setting, and again, you wouldn't really have it today. And it is a bit on the nose, where he takes the nose of the rocket off and says, right, this is what happened. But that's the wheeze of the story. A rocket has gone into space, and it is missing. It is missing for 57 hours, and it comes back, and then the real mystery starts. But before that, we have this long wait, but various things that happen that embed it in the time that it's set. As I say, the very first shot of this is stock footage of a test of a V2 rocket. Actually, the test shot was from New Mexico, I think, but the Quatermass rocket takes off from Woomera in Australia, which is where test flights did take place from at the time. And the Quatermass rocket has a nuclear motor, and of course, we're haunted by the memories of the Blitz and things falling from the sky, but also World War II was kind of brought to an end, certainly in the war in Japan was, by the dropping of something which was a weapon of the future, if you like, and the technology of the future, and as well as being a clash of the outrageous with the ordinary. We'll see lots of ordinary things and people coming up in this episode, and that's what Nigel Kneale does very well, is he drops the extraordinary into the ordinary, or it's also been described as Kneale is a meeting of the irrational with the irrational, and we see that with some of the way that characters react to things as well. And that's an explosive, a combustible combination, appropriately for something that exists in the shadow of the nuclear mushroom. But yes, for something that has become so timeless. And the infected astronaut, for this is what happens. This is a bit of stock footage of this instrumentation that is sort of fed into the live pictures. A and they'll have to have timed that very well, which is why I think some of this seems a little bit clunky, because you don't have the sort of precision of timing and the speed and the slickness that you get even as the serials progress over the 50s. Quatermass is extraordinary in the sense that there's a serial every couple of years, and television technology and indeed premises have there's another piece of, and I did identify where the stock footage comes from, but it comes to an end there before they cut back to the action, so you kind of get a blank screen again. But yeah, I painstakingly went through various different places to find out where that stock footage comes from, and actually it's the same place as other bits of stock footage come from in episode 2, but my goodness, I had to do some searching, and I don't know if anybody cares, but it's there in the book, and I'm glad. And you know, I couldn't tell you what it's called now, because of course when you're writing something down, you don't commit it to your brain like one used to when I was going through libraries and stuff, and I had to remember stuff to take home with me. It sort of had to embed itself in my brain, whereas now I'll read something today and forget it tomorrow, because I know that if I do forget it, I can just type it into a Google search engine again. Or in the case of Obscure Quatermass Facts, look at my manuscript. It's no longer a manuscript. It's actually a book. It's downstairs. All 70 of it. I've got 70 of it downstairs. So, yes, for something that is endured so much, it is very much a product of its time. Nigel Kneale taps into the concerns of the time, which makes the creeping atmosphere of Quatermass rather insidious, because the things that worry the characters are also things that are probably tapping in the back of the heads of the people who live in these times, which were anything but cozy. You know, we think, because of the way that people talk and say things like, don't worry, I won't let myself go, we think of the 50s and the 40s as being rather sort of cozy and proper, but that was all just a way of expressing oneself amidst a world that was harsh and cruel, and where all of these people on screen now will have lived through things that would give a modern person living in the Western world absolute heebie-jeebies and conniptions. I mean, you know, Reginald Tate fought in World War One. Reginald Tate was injured in battle in World War One, and he did actually serve in World War Two as well, but largely as an instructor with the RAF and things like that. But Hugh Kelly, who played John Patterson, was a man who's, I understand from my research, you know, whose nerves eventually got the better of him. But that actually, you can see why he was cast therefore as the character that he plays, John Patterson, who we will see later on in the story start to come apart at the seams. But here we have a wonderfully Kneale thing. I mean, again, the cameras are struggling with this a little bit, because a rocket has crashed, fortunately the right way up. In the film, it's stuck in the ground, you know. Or is it? Yeah. But anyway, listen, let's not talk about the film. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because the film is not even a gleam in anyone's... Well, actually, it is. People have written to Nigel Kneale just on the strength of the fact that it's a science fiction serial being shown on the television, saying, could you send us some scripts? We want to make this into a film. So, yeah, here is... The first person on the scene is Van Boolen, who is also the first person on the scene in Quatermass and the Pit. That's the more seen story. And here is Neil Wilson as the policeman, who is Sam Seeley in Spearhead from Space. The opening scenes of which are almost a shot-for-shot remake of Quatermass 2. So it does all... So if you normally listen to this for Doctor Who content, there is a bit. But yeah, we have a rocket smash into the side of the house, and credit to Richard R. Greenough, the very gifted designer who went on to become, you know, very senior design. Not at the BBC. He left the BBC fairly quickly. But he crashes a spaceship into the side of a house. The house is missing. You've got Katie Johnson later to win a BAFTA for playing Mrs. Wilberforce in The Lady Killers, where she has a scene where she talks about her next door neighbour saying a spaceship has been in her garden. And they have to do this. This is live, remember. This is a live broadcast where you have an old woman with a practical cat. That is an actual cat, a cacta, in a basket, and she is manoeuvred live on television down a ladder by another actor, not by a stuntman or a safety officer. They did get the ladder into rehearsals in order that they could practice this scene, but that's no mean feat. And this is a set where the top of the set, the half bedroom, and remember it's a half bedroom because the other half has been smashed away, has to support an actress who's brave enough to get up there. What is obviously, just a flat behind, so she would have probably had to have gone up via a ladder that side as well. And this is a very Nigel Kneale thing of having this sort of rather benign and charming old lady who's not unlike Judith Kerr was in her later age, actually, very quietly spoken and charming. I love the way that Van Boolen is with her here as Len Matthews, the first man on the scene. And she spots her mother's clock amongst the wreckage. Are you sure this thing hasn't gone off? W. Thorpe Devereux is waiting for his cue here, or he should have been doing better listening acting because he could have come in at any point there. But yeah, that's another slightly awkward. They have one go at this, and then it goes out, and there's no possibility for post production or performance tweaking or anything like that. So it's hard to do this stuff, especially with such ambition. You've cut from a scene, which is, literally bang next to where they are. This is all in the tiny studios at Alexandra Palace. Everything is not far from each other, and the actors moving from one scene to the other, sometimes getting changed, jumping over cables. The cables of the cameras have to not go over each other. There's no pause, and the things that they're being asked to do are high-end and extraordinary, and a lot of television is people talking in rooms, and this is hugely ambitious. And here we now cut to something which is I think one of the benefits of the need to broaden these stories out with characters and with scenes that are just dialogue. You have Oliver Johnston here as the news editor, Jacko, although well, we'll come to when he asks for somebody called Jackson later. And here is Paul Whitson-Jones as one of my favourite characters, James Fullerlove, who gets some absolutely terrific lines, particularly in the next episode. And he's this sort of cynical journalist who goes through a bit of a journey. He wants something to denounce, he tells Jacko here, and his interest is piqued by this rocket story, and you get the impression that he usually does more salacious stuff, but he wants something to get his teeth into, and actually goes on a journey where he learns that his cynicism is not the way to tackle this story, and he's the journalistic equivalent of the whore with the heart of gold. I need something to denounce, yes. Yeah, after the graphologists in the English flower show, something that's somebody's fault. I like that drive that he has to go, I want something where I can blame somebody. But he's rather effete, and he's got his buttonhole, and Whitson-Jones is great. And this is Colin Davis as the fireman, and I'd sort of written off ever finding anything out about him. There was a Colin Davis with a 1986 TV credit, and I thought, well, that's not going to be the same guy. Colin and Davis aren't exactly unusual names, and too often lazy books get two people with the same name with TV credits 30 years apart and go, that must be the same person, or that actor who's a bit part in Torchwood must have written that American film. Probably not. But actually, those two Colin Davises were the same. And I worked it out because the reason he was in the 1986 TV thing was because he was a musician in it. And our Colin Davis, who plays the fireman here, was a singer and a musician. And anyway, he's got a fascinating story that links him with one of the leading writers of our time, and just goes to show that even a not great actor with a couple of lines in one episode of the Quatermass Experiment, who only has, I think, one other television credit, or certainly not many, has a fascinating story to tell. And I ended up speaking to his son and finding out some really interesting stuff about him. And in fact, I've talked about him longer than he is on screen. And he just plays a Jobsworth fireman, because one of the delights of Nigel Kneale is, as well as being somebody who understands the nature of ancient horror and the fear of the unknown, is he's got a real bee in his bonnet about Jobsworths. And there's the fireman in this episode who goes, I'm going to make a report about this. There's a hospital sister in the next episode who says, I'm going to fill in a report about this. Somebody must have written a report that Nigel Kneale absolutely hated. And he has a great phrase where he talks about people in television who talk about, doing drafts and pitches. And he says there were no drafts of these scripts. He hand wrote them, and then they were typed up by the typing pool. And he says, people who talk of drafts and serious plans are people who've achieved power by dubious means, which I rather like. And these two journalists are Patrick Westwood and Dominic Lefaux. Lefaux was somebody I could have interviewed, and I kind of, when I discovered he was still around, and there was probably a way of getting hold of him, real life had kind of got in the way. But Mark Gatiss did interview him, but couldn't find his tape, unfortunately. So there is an interview with Lefaux. And then a really weird thing happened, that an actor I worked with on a production of West Side Story, Al Barkley, got in touch with me a few years ago and said, do you know about an actor called Dominic Lefaux? He'd obviously been aware that he was in Quatermass. And I said, yeah. And he said, there's a lockup with all his stuff in it. I'll see if I can find anything. And he said he didn't throw any letters away or anything. I said, if there's anything from 1953, have a look. See if there's a diary. Is he writing up about Quatermass? Couldn't find anything about Quatermass, but he has found some films that he's just transferred. And literally this week, while Quatermass is in the air, has said, I'll send them to you, but I don't think they're lost episodes of Quatermass. I didn't think they would be. Dominic Lefaux's only in the first 2 episodes anyway. They're the ones that exist. But how funny that, but completely independently, Al, my mate, who I was in a play with, is the person that is asked to look through the remaining stuff of Dominic Lefaux, who himself was a very interesting person. I have done in the book, I've done what happened to all of the actors, including that bloke, Nicholas Bruce, who is Lodovico in Orson Welles' Othello, which is not a bad part in a film prior to this. And even this guy, MacGregor Urquhart, as the non-speaking sandwich board man, was a writer and had some stuff made for television and books published. But because I wrote the book, it's not a book where it shows off all of the classic horror short stories that I have read, because actually I haven't read that many, and it doesn't show off my knowledge of folk horror and ley lines and all the sorts of things that clever people who write academic books with lots of footnotes do, because I didn't want to write that book, but I did want to write a book where I tell you everything I possibly can about all the people in it. So everybody, including this guy, Pat McGrath, who is one of the ones that I don't come to a particular necessarily comfortable conclusion about, but I do know that the details about him on IMDb are completely incorrect. So I at least correct those. This is a really funny scene where the BBC interviewer is talking to the couple who we've seen being a bit sort of squabbly, and particularly the sort of harridan wife who's been panicking when they think that the bomb has dropped, and she's wrapped her head in the sort of hair covering that the Hilda Ogden type of thing, and she's putting on a posh voice and saying how brave her husband was, and it's a delightful bit of comedy, wonderfully played by Iris Ballard, who I think has trouble with the scene where she gets panicking about the bomb. That doesn't quite work, but I think she's beautiful in that. But we did have another slightly clunky cut from scene where Van Boolen sort of pauses because he's supposed to be sort of being cut off mid-sentence. And here we have Dennis Windham as the reveller, or the drunk, as he's described in the script book, but he's a reveller here. A lot of his dialogue is slightly improvised. Well, we would say improvised now. They're augmentations of the written word. But I like Pat McGrath's rather jolly BBC correspondent here. And this is all about conjuring an atmosphere of celebration. The whole thing that Kneale wanted to do was, as he put it, strike a sour note about the optimism. So this thing has crashed, and it's initially everyone panics. They think it's a bomb. But when they realise it's a rocket that has returned from space, there's what he calls, he describes the astronauts, the returning astronaut, as a new Elizabethan hero. So there's a new Elizabeth Elizabethan fervour. We're at the start of a new era. Things are exciting. The world is moving further away from the war that blighted the previous decade and caused so much terror and horror and hardship. And it feels like the world is becoming colourful again. And Kneale goes, well, I want to shake that up because you shouldn't be too optimistic. And all of the stuff that feels like it may take us away from the Dark Ages. And Kneale is obsessed with the Dark Ages. Ancient horror is a very sort of palpable and terrible thing to him. But the things that take us out of the Dark Ages, that shine a light, the technology that produces the electricity that shines the lights, that technology could itself bring us back into a different, could sign us back to those Dark Ages, but using the most technological means imaginable. And it's a real push and pull in Kneale's work that that also has the beautiful effect of juxtaposition as well, and dissonance. Kneale does dissonance so well, the clashing of the ancient and modern, the possibilities for success and failure. And don't forget to bring me something back, says Isabel Dean here. That was the original title. The original title was actually The Unbegotten, but then the show was called Bring Something Back, which was a deliberately ironic title, although Murray Watson said, they laughed at the time because they thought it was so silly. But actually, that's the whole point of it. Judith sort of berates herself slightly later, saying, it was a crass and silly thing to say. This "how dare you" that Dennis Windham does rather brilliantly here, the sudden dignity of the drunk who's been hauled up suddenly taking effrontery, wasn't actually in the script, so that's a nice touch from the actor. And the sandwich boardman is a very witty touch too. So the ship is back, and all they've heard is a tapping from the inside. Oh, and lovely Paul Whitson-Jones, is full of love, gets an enjoyable monologue here. Quatermass is quite dismissive of his floweriness. But they were all in such big coats, aren't they? And those studios were boiling. They must have been sweating. I do wonder if... But I suppose everybody smoked, so it will smell more of tobacco than it will have sweat. That's a moment that I've been at screenings of this when people have seen it in public, and the bit where Hugh Kelly just goes and touches the outside and goes, oh, it's about 100 degrees. You go, well, you wouldn't do that now. You'd perhaps use an instrument and not bare flesh. The photographer standing behind, Fred, he's called. Oh, and look at Judith Horn, little Judith Horn. There is she's not a child. She's older than she looks, but she did a lot of sort of child parts because she was older than she looked, so useful to be there and not have to have the chaperone and things that you would need for a child actress. Everybody's pausing there, waiting for the ship to open, which it does rather slowly. The photographer Fred is Malcolm Watson, who has the distinction of being in Quatermass 2 and Quatermass and the Pit. He's not credited in this though, so it's not quite distinction of having a credited part in each one. But he's in all three serials, Malcolm Watson. And here we have the returned astronaut Victor Caroon. Victor is the name of the astronaut and the monster, but not the professor. And it's Duncan Lamont with his wonderful, mournful countenance. He's like a sort of sad golem, isn't he? And here we have a film sequence, because they didn't want to erect the spaceship set just for this one scene. So it's Kneale thinking ahead. He knew, because he understood how telly worked, and they had to plan this sort of stuff, even in the planning stages. And you have the empty spacesuits of the other two astronauts. So here's the mystery. Where are the two astronauts? They're not anywhere. And it looks so much better on film, doesn't it? So much better quality. Although Murray Watson, who was a marvellous and dignified actor, I think doesn't quite have it here. He's slightly histrionic. Which is a shame, which is ironically because he went on to have as good a career as anybody in this, and deservedly so. He was a fine actor, but he told me he didn't know why he'd been cast in this, because he wasn't a television guy at this point, and he didn't do television for a bit. As a matter of interest, this happens to be news, says Full of Love, rather patronisingly, reassuring his journalistic friends. And there's the mystery. The door hasn't been opened. The suits are empty. Where are the others? What happened? And what a great way to end the episode, with Duncan Lamont's face looming into camera and the end, it says. Not the end of episode 1, the end. So you'd be given to thinking that was it. But of course it continues over the next 5 weeks. We can see but 1 week, and that is the next week, episode 2. And we'll get into the reasons why, perhaps, when I talk through episode 2, when my guest will be John Deere, who has written a lot about Nigel Kneale and produced Quatermass Live at Alexandra Palace that I was in, and I played James Fullerlove, who, as you can see on the credits, that go at a beautifully readable speed here, was played by Paul Whitson-Jones. And the music is Inhumanity by Trevor Duncan, which is a stock piece of music that is glorious and gorgeous. So, but what we can see for now, yes, we can see episode 1 of the Quatermass Experiment, and I have to choose my 5 favourite things about it. So, and I think it would be too obvious to choose Nigel Kneale and Rudolph Cartier, who are both instrumental in the success of this Quatermass and the subsequent ones, and the productions get better and better, the scripts get more sophisticated, and they also, of course, produced together the seminal TV version of 1984, on which I'm on the official commentary with the 2 people who will be joining me for this Happy Times and Places, with John Deere and Andy Murray. So isn't that glorious? So, but yes, Nigel Kneale and Rudolph Cartier were the major TV figures of the 1950s, and that is largely due to Quatermass. But 1984 also massively put them on the map. So, but they wouldn't have probably got 1984 without the success of this, the Quatermass Experiment. I was always down on this first episode, really, because I always mourned the loss of the last 4, where the action really happens, particularly the last 2. But actually, there's so much to recommend this, and it's and without this episode, there wouldn't be any more Quatermass. And although it is very much scene setting, Nigel Kneale knows how to set scenes. He establishes character, he does the science bit, he does build up the tension, and he plays upon the fears of the time, and also throws in. So I'm going to try and choose things that exhibit why Nigel Kneale, in particular, and also Rudolph Cartier, are so key to the success of Quatermass. Well, there would be no Quatermass without Nigel Kneale. So just choosing him, I think, would be a cheat, although Andy is perfectly entitled to, because I didn't tell him what he couldn't choose, what he could and couldn't choose. But I'll buy myself a bit of time, because I think I should be able to choose Professor Quatermass himself, Reginald Tate, who I think is excellent. And the reason he doesn't play Quatermass throughout the 1950s is because almost exactly 2 years... it's 2 years and a day after the final episode of the Quatermass Experiment was broadcast, Reginald Tate got out of a taxi outside his Putney home and collapsed and had a heart attack and was rushed to hospital and died. And that was just weeks before production was due to begin on the sequel to this, Quatermass 2. That's another story. But Tate, I think, displays a wonderful synthesis of sort of weariness and worry, but the weariness and worry of a hard-working man who is perhaps plagued by his conscience, and the dynamism required of a pioneering professor who understands the gravity of the situation and the need to act quickly. There is an urgency about his performance and an authority, and key to his success, a naturalism. Some of the performances in Quatermass, by necessity and understandably, and it's not their fault that due to the passage of time and the way the different ways we enunciate and conduct ourselves, might need to be run through translation software in order to comfortably hit the ears and eyes of a modern viewer. And poor old Isabel Dean, I think, suffers particularly from that, because she is playing the distraught woman, and Isabel Dean was a fine actress, and as I say, one of the first real sort of television stars, and she was so kind to me as well. But Reginald Tate, I think, is very naturalistic. You can see why they liked using him on television, although actually there were some arguments about his merits amongst the hierarchy at the BBC, which are all outlined in my book, in which I have a huge chapter that gives you everything you need to know about Reginald Tate, and dug down quite deep into his personal story. So I hope there's plenty there that is new. And if you don't know anything about him, well, hopefully there'll be nothing left to know about him once you've read my chapter on him. But he gets a deserved chapter in the book, and I think he deserves to be highlighted as one of the strongest things about the Quatermass Experiment, and particularly about episode 1, where he is our guide through the potentially tedious exposition, but also he gives us what we need to know about the danger in the atmosphere and the problems at hand, especially in those opening scenes when they're hearing from the Australian voice, which, by the way, is not credited, but is Bruce Beebe, who is one of the stars of Journey into Space, the great radio science fiction. And so Bruce Beebe plays George Harris, the Australian voice, not credited on any of the paperwork or on screen, but it is him, and I know that, and that's one of the many things that will be covered in the book that is not currently available in any other sort of cast listings or anything else. So I've made sure the cast list is as accurate as can possibly be, and there are a few anomalies that again aren't featured in the paperwork, but a little bit of digging and dissecting and cross-referencing can make me confident enough that I know who's who, what's what, and what's where. Despite and sometimes despite and sometimes in contravention of what the paperwork says. But anyway, Reginald Tate is my first choice, but I have to choose something that is emblematic of Nigel Kneale, and I think it has to be that clash of the extraordinary with the ordinary, and that is, I think, most embodied by the spaceship in a suburban street, the spaceship that smashes in half the house of an old lady, and you have the old lady played beautifully by Katie Johnson, who's got her cat, who's worried about her cat called Henry. The old lady, and so is it the rocket in the street, or is it the rocket in the old lady, or is it a bit of both? The fact that you have this charming old lady taking it all rather in her stride, which I think speaks to something of us and our nation in the 1940s and how we dealt with the terrible things that were happening, and I don't think that's to be underestimated, and I don't think that's something to be cynical about either. And I think it's important that stuff is still being echoed. It gives us a sense of a national character that I think we actually lose sight of at our peril, and our tendency, I think, to sometimes put ourselves down, which is no bad thing, because being self-aggrandizing is often can disguise shortcomings and forgive ourselves for malignancies and bad behaviours. But I think now we need a little bit. Actually, we perhaps need a little bit of national pride back. And I think, there were things that there were ways that we conducted ourselves during the darkest hour that were admirable and spoke of the great qualities of the humblest of individuals, including dotty old ladies who had to take things in their stride. And I think and I think that could perhaps not have happened at another time, which is another example of where something that just seems like it's an interesting juxtaposition, the old and the new, the ordinary, the extraordinary. Oh, look, we've got a funny old lady, but that actually speaks to stuff that was going on at the time as well, and yet has become kind of timeless. So it's contemporary and timeless at the same time, which is probably no mean feat, being able to pull off being that. So yeah, the rocket crashing into the old lady's house, I think, is a very important element of it. The third thing I would like to choose, there's a brilliant bit in Kneale's script that I think speaks to his approach to humour and to character, and it may not even be apparent and the actor tries to do it. There's a great bit where the BBC interviewer says to Professor Quatermass, tell me about the other members of the crew, and tell me about the members of the crew. And Quatermass goes, there's Charles Green. He says, there's Dr. Ludwig Reichenheim. You probably remember his experiments with rockets prior to the war, whatever it is that he says. And it says, interview, and then the dialogue in the script says, interviewer, open brackets, who doesn't, close brackets. And Pat McGrath does a kind of, oh, yes, all right. And he sort of goes, yes, I do. And you sort of get the impression he's probably making that up. But I think that speaks volumes. And Kneale's script is full of bits like that where he'll say something about a character that is quite often, I think, probably beyond the abilities of the actors, of what they were able to convey at the time, and that's partially to do with the practicalities of how things were done, but also how things were performed. But that senses that he's got a sense that his characters have things that go on underneath, and he can be quite snarky about people, particularly people doing jobs, which is rather gorgeous. And he remains a bit like that. If he was a good one for an angry letter, was Kneale. But it does mean his characters. He has a fun sense of character about him, and even fun stage direction. So I like that stage direction and what it says about the beyond just the interaction of the two characters, but where they're coming from different places, and the sense of humour, because Kneale meant a lot of this to be funny, and not all of the humour works or has carried itself through to this day. But my goodness, humour dates more than anything. But actually, the ambition and the tone of what he's trying to do with the humour, because if there is humour there, it makes the horrific more horrific, is of sound intent. And again, I think he develops this and sharpens it slightly better perhaps later on. But it all adds to that melange of dissonance that Kneale is an exemplar of. So 1, Reginald Tate; 2, the juxtaposition of the spangly new space rocket and the ordinary London street, and the combustive meeting of both. And we've added into that Katie Johnson as well, being charming and an old lady in the face of that spectacle. Kneale's sense of humour as evidenced by his attention to detail, even in the stage direction, to what he's saying about a character. I think I probably have to choose the music. Mars, Bringer of War is a great way to open. Trevor Duncan's Inhumanity is a great way to close. They didn't really have specially composed music. They didn't have many film sequences. All the things that we're kind of used to if we've been watching television, even from the 1960s. They have very little at their disposal, and what they do have has to be deployed, with excellent selection and probably a lot of listening to discs and choosing the right things. But Mars turns out to be really appropriate for Quatermass, considering what Quatermass and the Pit is all about. Although actually Mars isn't the theme tune to Quatermass and the Pit, but Mars is such a brilliant piece of music, and they've chosen an absolutely banging bit of it to open the episode with, and to open each episode with. And Trevor Duncan's closing music is also superb. So the music that is chosen that really gives this power and punch and welly and atmosphere, and I absolutely love it. And there are just a few music cues in the middle, largely to segue from one scene to the other, because again it was quite hard to line up music exactly. They do try that a bit with Quatermass too, where there are sort of stings, but this is much more sort of dropped in, and my goodness, it's hard. A lot, and it's so ambitious what they decide to do here. And my last favourite thing is, it has to be the character of James Fullerlove. It would be all well and good having the story of scientists, investigating what goes wrong and its intrusion into everyday lives, but to have it told through the eyes of the media. Kneale does this a lot. We later get a BBC van filming Westminster Abbey, which is where the Queen Elizabeth had her coronation only 6 weeks earlier. And so it becomes meta, because we see the monster that Victor Carroon turns into via a live broadcast from Westminster Abbey as we're watching a live broadcast drama. Amazing. But it's because Kneale was the son of a journalist, and so we have a gaggle of journalists here, which add to the sort of verisimilitude, but also opens it out. That BBC announcer, we get the impression that this story is going round the world, and in fact, in his planning, he did want a French newsreader and an American newsreader. He wanted to open this up, and the way that he thought was the easiest way to do that was to tell it through the media in different places, and we see that in Doctor Who today, when Russell T Davies' stories, have newsreaders from all over the world showing. It's a very clever shorthand to show how events are reverberating around the world, and having this cynical journalist. I mean, the fact that he's a wonderfully written character, the fact that they get the mighty Paul Whitson-Jones, who goes on to be one of television's most recognisable character actors, and is probably he's among the most memorable characters in this, and he's different from all the other characters as well. He's slightly cynical. But as I say, he's not unsensitive, and he gets some of the best lines, and it's a lovely performance, and it just gives a different dimension where, just when it's getting all too much or getting all a bit, we think we know where we are with it, we suddenly come for a little bit of poetry in the press room, and a little bit of wry commentary from Fuller Love, who is also a very insightful character as well, and helps to, and is sometimes a sounding board for members of his trade who are less nice than he is. So he's a useful storytelling device, but who is also, I think, a brilliant character. So there we have it. Those are my 5 favourite things about episode 1 of the Quatermass Experiment. Andy Murray, my friend, and somebody who has a claim to have written, far more worthy stuff about, and I suspect more intellectually rigorous stuff than I, about Nigel Kneale and all of his influences and skills, and the thematic relevance of various things throughout the Kneale oeuvre. Is going to choose his 5 favourite things about the Quatermass Experiment. That is a thing he knows well and will have plenty of interesting things to say about.
Okay, so for my first of the 5 choices, I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to choose the actual opening second of the whole thing, specifically the theme. That brilliant choice of Holst's Mars, bringer of war. It's just wonderful, and we're kind of used to it now, and especially if we're fans of this sort of thing, we associate it with Quatermass. But it's a brilliant choice, but also that's a much longer piece of music. It's about 7 minutes long or so usually in performance, and this isn't the start of the piece. This is some way in. This is a real crescendo where it's been building towards. So to just open bang with that, it's so powerful. It's so dramatic and tense, and it sounds evil. It's just a really brilliant choice, and it kind of, in terms of setting the stall. From the second that this starts, I think that's a brilliant choice, and it works really wonderfully. I think even on an old TV, small TV with small speakers, the impact of that must have been enormous.
I love listening to that. Well, one, because Andy has chosen one of the things I chose, so that means I'm starting ahead. Andy is also a very quiet and unassuming man. He's a very smart man, but he's not an overly demonstrative fellow. He's very gentle and softly spoken. And to hear the enthusiasm in his voice there, this reminds us why we convene and exchange ideas and revel in the stuff that we love, because it's the stuff of life, and it gives us, it gives us it powers our blood through our veins, doesn't it? And to hear Andy speaking so passionately about that, which is basically the title music to something, and it's not even proper title music because it's just been lifted out of a record, but as he said, it's very specifically part of the music. And to hear him speak in the way that he did, not just with the insight and because he put it so well and he summed it up very well, but just the sheer enthusiasm. Isn't that great? So thanks, Andy. And yes, but I'm afraid it's 1 point to me. I'm afraid you don't get any points for enthusiasm if you choose the same thing as me. All you do is give me a point. 1-0 to me. What's Andy's second thing?
For my second choice, I'm going to go for the scene with Blaker, the senior civil servant. That wonderful moment specifically when Quatermass is talking to him about sort of rocket separation, and Blaker doesn't get it. And Quatermass just quietly said, "I thought you hadn't understood." And it's really clever. It's a really brilliant piece of writing, I think, because, this is 1953, so we're still 16 years away from the moon landing. We're still quite a way away from the sort of general audience being very familiar with rocket launches and how they work. So you need to explain it to them. So you have the scene of Quatermass and Blaker, and it explains it, but does it with humour and with character. So you have Quatermass as the expert, kind of rolling his eyes that the man who has power and influence hasn't got a clue and he's a bit of an idiot, and he's going to have to explain it to him with diagrams and a model, and in doing so obviously explain it to the audience. So it kind of takes that necessity and turns it into a really good little clever character moment.
Oh, damn, I wish I'd put that in the book. That's brilliant. Thanks, Andy. Now that it's gone to press, now that it exists downstairs, I'm going to scribble that in my copy. A really good point. And yes, that is a telling line. I was sure that you hadn't understood. It says everything. And Nigel Kneale, who would later get very cross with how television worked, is actually predicting the future of television, because even after Nigel Kneale's death, the clued up people who know what they're doing having to explain things to idiots who hold too much power, who are incompetent. That was very, very much the state of the industry that Nigel Kneale was a pioneer in. Unfortunately, even somebody with as apocalyptic and doom-laden an attitude as he sometimes had about the future could not perhaps have predicted that the parlous state of the medium that he helped to launch would resonate with a scene in his very first 6-part original TV drama where some exposition is, as Andy said, rather artfully placed in and done through with character, wit, and humour. So yeah, he does the science bit that's necessary for the audience, but he does it in a way that is significantly less clunky than it could have been because of the deft little touches with which he scripts it. Yeah, very good. And also, damn.
And also, in doing so, Blaker becomes the forefather of every Doctor Who man from the Ministry that we're going to meet in later years, who is just going to annoy the Doctor by being a bit of a fool.
Oh, and sorry, I'd obviously cut Andy off before he'd finished his point, because I haven't heard these before. So I'm that bit about the Doctor Who's was obviously to do with the point that he'd been making about the exposition scene, and one of the nice connections with that is that one of the stupidest men from the Ministry in Doctor Who is Chin in The Claws of Axos, who is played by Peter Bathurst, who we will see in episode 2 of the Quatermass Experiment. He is one of the Doctor Who Quatermass actors, as he is one of the missing astronauts, Charles Green. So yes, it's quite fun that he becomes one of the characters that Andy was talking about there.
My third choice, I'm going to go for the scene at the crash site, the first time we see it, which is a real contrast to what's gone before. So obviously before that, it's been quite a lot of sort of high-blown stuff with, mission central control room and talk of rocket launches and, the rockets going very far off course and so on and so forth. And then he grounds it totally. On one level, this is an amazingly ambitious thing to try and do, to try and realise the aftermath of a rocket crash on live television. but in doing so, he does it with real sort of a real lightness of touch and real humour. You've got Len Matthews and his wife, and specifically, I think you've got Katie Johnson as Miss Wilde looking out for Henry the cat, and it's all just very sweet and just very normal. It brings it down to earth, doesn't it? Sort of very literally. And there's that lovely moment where Miss Wilde said, "Have they started again?" So it's as extraordinary as all this stuff is, you're kind of reminded that these are people who've lived through extraordinary times. But I just think, as a whole, that particular scene is just a brilliant way to achieve what needs to be achieved, to show the aftermath of the rocket launch, but also to bring it into reality and to make it feel a lot more human and maybe even quite funny.
Yeah, I mean, I think we maybe used slightly different methodology, but I think we arrived at the same destination. I think there were enough of the same things in that I get the point for that. Yes, I should have highlighted actually when I was talking about the humour is that I do think the way that Iris Ballard changes her voice and says, "Yes, my husband was very brave. He should get a medal," is absolutely brilliant. And if you've ever met anyone from that generation, that's exactly the way that they would react if they suddenly needed to be putting on their posh voice or their airs and graces or doing something is beautiful. And it's a great bit of comedy, especially how we've seen them before as the sort of squabbling, and you can imagine how they are behind closed doors is very different to how they present themselves to the BBC. But yeah, I think I get the point for that, because I think Andy and I were barking up the same tree about the rocket smashing in, what it echoed, how it's treated. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, 2-1 to me. I'm taking that. I'm in a confident mood. And we all know what happens when you do something with such confidence, is that you can usually get lost and then return by crashing.
So my fourth choice, there's that wonderful sequence at the crash site where there's kind of a carnival atmosphere is broken out, and there's all sorts going on at the same time, and various kind of conversations, characters roaming around and conversations happening. And it's brilliantly clever, really, because nothing's really happening, and it's important that nothing happens, because if they just sort of raced up and threw open the rocket within seconds, it wouldn't have built up any kind of tension. We need to ramp the tension right up, really, until the climax of the episode. So at this stage, you've just got a lot of anticipation, and there's some serious stuff going on. You've got Quatermass and the team sort of going about their work, and the reporters are trying to get the story off them. But you've also got lovely things like Len Matthews and his wife again sort of talking to reporters, and his wife being very proud of him. Conversely, you've got the tipsy man wandering around telling everybody off for being too modest. You've got the end is nigh sandwich board man roaming around and not saying anything, but just getting his point across. I think all of this is wonderful, and I'd be tempted to choose the whole scene, but if I want to choose one moment, one thing in here, it's that moment when Judith is talking to the reporter and tells the story that Victor promised to bring her something back. And as we know, Bring Something Back was an early title for the Quatermass Experiment. And knowing the story as we do, we get the meaning because we know it's going to happen. But in the context of the story, in the context of sort of storytelling, that's again another brilliantly clever moment of dropping the very first hint very darkly, because it's kind of within this story of him promising to do something nice for her. But if we're watching closely at the time, we might have noticed that this is the first hint of what's to come, that something bad is going to come back with him.
Well, yes, and that's vitally important, of course. Yes, as well as it being the sort of trite thing that Judith berates herself for it being, and Murray Watson finding so funny. It is a horrendous double meaning, because he does bring something back, but it's not a meteorite for the mantelpiece. It's not a lovely trinket. It is something, something unknowable, something. I mean, something. The word something in Nigel Kneale's hands has such relevance because his aliens, his threats are kind of unknowable and nebulous. They are something rather than a name, a Gorgon, a Martian. It is something unreachable, something untouchable. So the word something, used by Nigel Kneale, has a terrible unknowability about it, and he does bring something back, and we never quite know what the thing is. The closest we get is it being described rather gorgeously as a plankton of the ether, but brings something back. There's a terrible irony about that. His sense of humour is such that he can even apply it to actually what is the deep sadness and horror at the heart of his story, is that he does bring something back and it destroys him.
For my fifth and final choice, I couldn't not choose the emergence of Victor from the rocket. The whole episode's been building up to this, obviously, and all the characters are awaiting it, and all the characters on the scene are waiting to see what happens, what's going to come out, if anything, from the rocket. And it's done really well. It's the ramp lowers, even the timing of it is nice because he doesn't sort of leap out as a sort of, in contrast to the scene that's gone before, which is quite sort of busy and noisy. Suddenly it's kind of pin drop silence, and then Victor Carroon emerges, just Victor Carroon, just the one, stumbles out, and it's not actually the climax, but it's kind of leads into the cliffhanger, this fact that somebody's still in there, just one person, and that moment as he comes out for me is brilliant, and it kind of it turns the story back into something that's very dramatic and full of mystery still at this stage.
Good choice, and it is superb. And I'm surprised you didn't choose Reginald Tate. Interesting. I'm not surprised you didn't choose the stage direction. Who doesn't? Although again, I think we were sort of alluding to nearly the same things when we were picking out those little bits about the sort of scene of reveling. I just decided to articulate it through perhaps one of the most arcane references I could possibly conjure. And I'm probably not surprised you didn't choose. I nearly was, because I would probably choose, because Full of Love has some gorgeous speeches in the next episode, which perhaps would make him a better choice for episode 2. But I have a different guest for episode 2, so who knows what's going to go on there. But I think I didn't quite manage to snatch a victory from Andy there. But I don't care. I'm very happy. I'm very happy that Andy is my friend. I'm very happy that I live not far away from somebody with whom I share an extreme passion, and Andy very kindly comes to my comedy night every Tuesday, which I don't mention Quatermass at every Tuesday, or have been recently, and so he's part of another part of my life that's very important to me as well, and that's really nice to have him up the road. And God, it's been over 20 years. Wow, that's incredible. So it was really important to get him on this, and he's been very kind enough to be there all the way through my journey of writing this Quatermass book, a book he could easily have written and might well have written better, but kindly allowed me to take my own sweet time in doing it. There's still 19 seconds left on this track, so let's see if he's adding anything or if I've cut him off again.
I've very much enjoyed rewatching that first episode, any excuse really, and I hope you have too. I think I can pretty much guarantee that you did. And last but not least, hearty congratulations to you on the occasion of publication of the book.
Thanks, Andy. Well, yes, and that is why I'm sorry, Doctor Who fans, but I make no apology. Well, I've just said I'm sorry, so I've made sort of an apology for derailing your Doctor Who listening, actually halfway through a story, but that's okay. Quatermass itself Quatermass Experiment suffered its own interruptions. Episode 6 did have a technical breakdown. To talk about Quatermass, which I will be doing this week and next week on Happy Times and Places. If you're a Doctor Who fan, you will love Quatermass. I hope it is slightly different. I mean, Doctor Who is the thing closest to my heart, but Quatermass is special, and it's amazing. I'm overjoyed that it is a passion shared by a certain Mark Gatiss, and as a result I've got to know him more than a little bit through that, and I've been so lucky to have very painstakingly managed to make contacts and get hold of things and materials that even 5 years ago would have been undreamable and unreachable. And it just goes to show, I have to say, because I had the idea, I entertained the idea of writing a book about Quatermass in 1989, when the Quatermass Experiment was 36 years old. It is 36 years later, and finally that book has appeared. I'm immensely proud of it. Of course, as I've got it now, and as I listen to Andy talking, there are things I wish I'd said. There are probably typos that have crept in, even some factual mistakes. I do hope not. It's amazing how when it's all there, though, and it's all a bundle, we made some last-minute changes of things that I thought, why hadn't I noticed that the previous 90 times I've read it? And there are, of course, probably things that I would do differently. But the fact that it exists, when so many times over the years where I thought that it was just a dream or it was just something I said, but I never really believed would happen, because it's important that there are books about Quatermass. It's important, I think, that it has the testimony that it deserves, because it is not a piece of cult television. It is a television milestone. The people who made it were exemplars of their craft, and the work that they did massively influenced the development of the medium, but they weren't just stepping stones towards great stuff that we had since. They were great in and of their own right, and they remain, I think, magnificent achievements. Even compared to the other two serials that we have all of as well, the relatively clunky and primitive and occasionally stodgy The Quatermass Experiment, there is still so much that is marvellous, even though it's quite hard to discern these days because the pictures that we have aren't of the best quality either. But it's worth, it's the metaphor I've used earlier, running it through your translation software in order to appreciate it for what it was saying at the time and how it was saying it, because there's still so much in there that is really, really impressive. And Nigel Kneale was a genius. Rudolph Cartier, the producer, was a genius. And there are some great actors in there too, and some wonderful lines. And it's a story from its time, of its time, that resonates like a nuclear explosion, which was threatening to happen at any time, or was waiting in the wings, and actually has been waiting in the wings ever since. We're all in the shadow of technology that can, unlock our salvation or open the door to our destruction. And that is one of the things that Nigel Kneale was wrestling with. That is something that still is being wrestled with by us as a species today. It's brilliant stuff. If you haven't seen Quatermass, please do read the scripts. Read the script books that are available from Arrow, or their old Penguin ones you can pick up in car boot sales or off eBay or wherever. Nigel Kneale was a brilliant imaginative writer, and Quatermass is marvellous. So marvellous I could write a book about it. Oh, I have. It's available from 10 Acre Films, published on May the 12th, 2025. And I do hope you've enjoyed this edition. Thanks to Andy Murray for being my special guest. And I will have another special guest, the mighty John Deere, when I do episode 2, which I would love you to listen to as well. That will be at the same time next week. And don't worry, Doctor Who will return after that. But for now, thank you very much for listening to episode 1 of The Quatermass Experiment here on Happy Times and Places, which on the publication of my first solo book is definitely a very happy time and place. Thanks for listening. My name's Toby, and ta-ta. Thanks very much for listening to Happy Times and Places, which is presented by me, Toby Hadoke, and my special guest, Andy Murray, whose book Into the Unknown, which is the biography of Nigel Kneale, which is based on extensive interviews with the man himself is well worth getting and adding to your collection. It's a terrific book that tells you all about the Kneale oeuvre. I'm grateful to Andy and to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Graham Cluley, Kevin Clark, Steve Churchill, Susan Christian, Phil Chapman, Damien Cartin, Anthony Carroll, Paul Carrington, Jim Cameron, DC, Tim Burrows, Hugh Buchtman, David Grody, Julian Botting, Gareth Bowley, Robin Bland, Peter Blackett, Richard Bignell, Andy Bennison, Ollie Barrett, Simon Barker, John Ball, Richard Baker, P. Baker, John Babb, Richard Alt, Simon Ash, Endaf Arwin, Radit Aritza, Tilt Areza, Sebastian April, Neil Allen, Kit Allen, Mark Aldridge, Keith Adams, Joan Abbott and Joel Aarons. The music is by Dave Gates, the artwork by Dylan Patterson. I am so grateful to those patrons, and if you would like to become one of their number, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Toby Hadoke, where you get advance releases, bonus releases, exclusives, and all sorts of other goodies. You can also support me by going to kofi.com/Toby Hadoke, where you don't have to do a monthly commitment, but can occasionally throw a few pennies into my hat if I've done a podcast you particularly like or I sound particularly hungry. And you can support these in other ways other than financial, and I'm just grateful to you for listening, so absolutely no pressure so to do. Thanks for just putting my noise into your ears. There's plenty of other things out there to choose from, but if you do enjoy listening to these, then I'd really be grateful for 5 stars and a few lines of review wherever you get your podcasts. And also remember to like, subscribe, thumbs up, and generally polish those algorithms with all the positivity that you possibly can. I also have a YouTube channel I'd like you to like and subscribe to, where these podcasts are already also available as audio only broadcasts. As well as YouTube, I'm all over the social media. So we have Instagram at Toby.Hadoke. I'm on Blue Sky at Toby Hadoke and all the Blue Sky business that they put in the name. It's quite long-winded, I think, but I'm the only me there. At Hadoke Podcasts on X, as well as at Toby Hadoke. I have 2 X accounts, one just for these podcasts and one for my other stuff, which is where I plug a lot of my comedy and things like that. And I also have a page on Facebook, and I have a website, www.tobyhadoke.com. So there we are. It's now very late, but I have to say it's an astonishing feeling. I never thought this book would happen, and at the moment I'm now going through my head going, oh, I wish I'd changed that. I wish I'd written that differently. Blah, blah, blah. But I think at the time I've done all that I can, and that Stuart, the editor, Stuart Manning, I'm talking about here from 10 Acre Films, editor and book designer, has done an absolutely terrific job. And there's approaches that I've done to it, which has been a bit. I don't think I have a system, but I certainly am going to learn from the last minute panic we had. I mean, I thought we'd done it, and I said, I'm just going to do one more proofread, and suddenly things leapt out where I went, that's in the wrong place, I've got that wrong, that doesn't make sense, no, blah, blah, blah. And Stuart very patiently moved things around, changed things, did it, didn't tell me off, absolutely got out the best in me, but also made sure the book was the best it could possibly be, with diligence and patience. And I think, I was given plenty of opportunities to change any bits I wasn't happy with, and so anything wrong with it now, well, hindsight is 20/20, but I was pretty much in it, and I was given the opportunity to produce the book I wanted to produce, and I think I produced the book I wanted to produce at the time. Now, of course, once something's set in stone, you then go, ah! But no, I have to remember, this was my dream to do this. I've been wanting to do this since I was a 16-year-old boy, when you can have such dreams, but you don't believe they'll happen. I mean, I wanted to build a spaceship and go to space as well, but that's never going to happen. I know that's never going to happen, but also, judging by what happens in the Quatermass Experiment, it's probably quite wise. It's a dangerous thing to be doing. But there were so many times I gave up on this being an idea, and I sometimes would have a dream that it was out, and then I'd wake up and slowly come to terms with the fact that, oh no, I haven't actually written the book. Damn. And now it's not a dream, it's a reality. So, my goodness. That's that's quite amazing, because I'd given up on it a number of times, and now there's going to be 5 of it. Oh my God! Better get on with the next one. But yeah, just in case you haven't picked it up, May the 12th, 10 Acre Films, the Quatermass Experiment, not available from Amazon or any of those sorts of places. Get it direct from the publisher, and I hope you enjoy it. And please let me know if you have.